recording now.
This meeting is now being recorded.
Hello, this is David Lee from Prevent Connect, and welcome to today's Power and Prevention Ending Child Sexual Abuse web conference series, sponsored by Prevent Connect and Ms. Foundation for Women. This session is Expected and Unexpected Partnerships and Funding. Power and Prevention Ending Child Sexual Abuse series is a national project of Prevent Connect and the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault with support from the Ms. Foundation for Women. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the Ms. Foundation for Women or CalCASA. So with that, I am really pleased to introduce our series co-hosts. We've been going on, this is our fourth year of actually doing these web conferences, and we've been working with Cordelia Anderson and Joan Tabachnik. I'm really pleased to have both of you here today. So thank you, Joan, and Cordelia, I'm going to hand the podium over to you.
Thank you very much, David. And I know that Joan and I, as long-term prevention advocates for prevention, have been delighted to be part of these webinars and are very excited about this one today. And David, I'm going to ask you because I'm not able to go forward on this, or Joan, the learning objectives for today are that we want to understand the challenges in funding child sexual abuse prevention. We all know that there are challenges, and we want to be able to talk about some potential funding opportunities that may be open to this movement and describe the importance of evidence-based approaches and evaluation to funding. On this next slide, going back to the challenges for funding, we're up against that child sexual abuse sometimes is just viewed as too big, too overwhelming, like it's a big black hole. Can we really make a difference? And we know we are really advocating for people to understand that this is preventable. And funders don't always believe that that is true. We also need to help them and help all of us see that there are solutions, highlight what's promising, inspiring, and working. And when it comes to child sexual abuse, where it feels like we know we fit within sexual violence and we know we fit within child maltreatment and neglect, yet sometimes it feels like it gets lost in both of those pools. So we'll be hearing from people that really represent across that piece. And Joan, you're next.
Great, thank you. So what we've been seeing, and between Cordelia and I, we've been working in this field for many, many years, and we've been seeing there's actually some growing consensus that although prevention has never been very well funded, and then not just prevention of child sexual abuse, but prevention generally, and most of it may be because it's easier to respond to a crisis, but we see that mentality, so that it's beginning to shift. And one of the places we've seen that is, and Larry Cohen speaks very eloquently about this, where he talks about the healthcare expenditures, the cost in the United States is just rapidly increasing. It's now at $2.8 trillion a year. And because of that, there's a growing consensus to reduce healthcare spending through prevention by looking at how do we reduce the rates of the conditions and the behaviors that are preventable. So I love this example. It says, why invest in prevention? And what would you say about investment that returned 5,500%? I think most of us, even without MBAs, would say that's a pretty good return. And what they've what wonderful example coming from California is that what they have successfully reinvested the money from the cigarette taxes in California's tobacco control program. So from between 1989 and 2008, they invested $2.4 billion. And what they found was that actually the investment saved $134 billion in reduced medical expenditures. So when there's money that is available and we reinvest that money in the same issue, we're actually seeing that significant reduction. So back to you, Cordelia.
Okay, and on this next one, it really looks at the impact of sexual violence on children throughout their lives. And we know that all types of violence have an impact, and particularly child sexual abuse. For example, in our last seminar on sexual abuse to prison pipeline showed the effect of all the ACEs, but so much with child sexual abuse, particularly on girls of color, but on the social and emotional and cognitive impairment, the health issues, immediate and long-term, social problems, and all the way up to and including early death. So really quality of life, mental and physical health. And we've got to ask, do we know the impact And we certainly do. And it's a huge financial impact of $124 billion. Now, there's different studies, but this is taking from one with the Center of Disease Control that always get at that health economic burden of child maltreatment. Joan often talks about this quote by James Mercy that is so powerful. And he just talks about, imagine a childhood disease that affects 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 7 boys before they reach 18. A disease that can cause dramatic mood swings, erratic behavior, severe conduct disorders among those exposed. A disease that breeds distrust of adults and undermines the possibility of experiencing normal sexual relationships. A disease that can have profound implications for an individual's future health by increasing the risk of problems such as substance abuse, sexually transmitted diseases, suicidal behavior. A disease that replicates itself by causing some of the victims to expose future generations to its debilitating effects. Imagine what we as a society would do if such a disease exists. We would spare no expenses. We would invest heavily in basic applied research. We divide systems to identify those affected and provide services to them. We develop and broadly implement prevention campaigns to protect our children, wouldn't we? Such a disease exists. It's called child sexual abuse. Joan?
Yeah, and I think that partly that quote is so powerful because Jim Mercy said that in 1999. So this is something that we have been working on for many years. And this is just a chart that I find is really helpful when we think about the issues of child, who's affected by the policies and programs. And if we think about that, that in 1 in 3 or 4 girls, 1 in 6 to 10 boys are affected, it's like when we start with 100 incidents, that very few of those incidents are actually reported. We know that child sexual abuse is one of the most underreported crimes. And so if you think about of that 100, 10 to 18 are actually reported. Of those, maybe a third go to trial, and then of those, maybe a half are actually convicted. So if you look at that, then think of all of the vast majority of our resources are going to that very small group of people who actually are going through the system. But what about the other people, the people who there's a concern, there's a report, or they're never reported? And there were people who actually, what can we do in primary prevention? What can we do before those 100 incidents come up? So what we're looking at today is how do we include in our funding, include in our emphasis in our policies and our programs, not just those individuals who actually go through the entire system, but everybody who needs to be affected. Back to you, Cordelia.
Okay, well, in this next one, we're going to introduce our core presenters here today, and there's a lot to say about each of them. We're so proud that we have these 3 here today, and I'll just give all their brief versions of their bios right now, and then they'll be speaking in order, starting with Joanne Schledel. And Joanne is a licensed marriage and family therapist since 1981. She created the first counselor certification program at the University of Louisville for addressing violence and sexual harm by youth, and she continues to teach a variety of trauma-informed courses. She's executive director and founder of Resources for Resolving Violence, Inc., and she does a lot of different consultation, program development, evaluation, clinical supervision, and training. She's received a lot of awards, made hundreds of presentations throughout the world on a wide range of topics, has written several different chapters in different books, and particularly we're excited to hear as she talks to us about her recently authored a trauma-informed approach to adolescent sexual health. Her work is currently being evaluated for effectiveness through a 5-year multi-site federal grant addressing trauma-informed approaches for adolescent sexual health. Beverly Fortson is a PhD who currently works as a behavioral scientist on the Child Maltreatment and Sexual Violence team in the Research and Evaluation Branch of the Division of Violence Prevention in the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control at the Centers for Disease and Control Prevention. Her research interests are in primary and secondary prevention of child maltreatment and interventions for children with trauma exposure and behavior problems. She focuses primarily on research examining the effectiveness of interventions. But she began her career at CDC in 2008. Before that was an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina and has her master's and her PhD in clinical child psychology. She has provided clinical services to children and families for over 14 years and is a licensed clinical psychologist. Louis DeBaca was appointed by President Barack Obama as the Director of the Justice Department's Office of Sex Offender Sentencing, Monitoring, Apprehending, Registering, and Tracking, the SMART Office. Mr. DeBaca has previously coordinated the U.S. government activities in the global fight against contemporary forms of slavery as Ambassador at Large for the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. And he served as a counsel to the House Committee on the Judiciary at Justice Department from 1993 to 2006. He led the investigation and prosecution of cases involving human trafficking, but also office misconduct, hate crimes, money laundering, and other crimes. He's the recipient of the Secretary of State's Distinguished Honor and Attorney General's Distinguished Honor Awards, the Attorney General John Marshall's Award, and the Director Award from the Executive Office of the U.S. Attorney's Office. He's also received a leading honor by the National Human Trafficking Victims Service Providers, the Freedom Network Paul and Sheila Wellstone Award, and has been named Michigan Law School's Distinguished Latino Alumni. So we have a very distinguished panel. We are honored to have you here, and we will begin with Joanne.
Great. So welcome, Joanne.
Thank you very much. And I want to offer most humble and profound thanks to David, Cordelia, and Joan for this important invitation. And what I'm going to do is to take hopefully a maximum of 10 minutes, kind of moving pretty quickly through a foundation, because I think what is most important about this webinar is to have time for discussion and to respond to questions and concerns that all of you who are participating have. So I'm going to talk a little bit by way of introduction about a trauma-informed approach for prevention, and I think particularly about my involvement with the federal government as we move into the issue of funding. And actually, I think that accidentally went forward, so I've gone back to by way of introduction. So a key element to me that will relate to funding as we go forward is that RRV is all referred to Resources for Resolving Violence. We are a for-profit, licensed trauma-informed mental health agency providing intensive in-home services, program development, education, and training. I'm here from the state of Maine where we are licensed, and I think it's important for participants to know that in our state, to be able to call your licensed mental health agency trauma-informed, we have to meet state criteria through self-assessment and ongoing assessment. And these are key elements of what the federal government is interested in that I'll talk about in a few minutes. Our clinical services address prevention within the context of trauma therapy in accordance with SAMHSA guidelines. So I assume that many of you do know, but I'm going to go ahead and clarify that SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and they have provided definitions and guidelines that we are adhering to in terms of the research and funding elements that we're involved in. A key element of our programming at RRV is that we have both licensed mental health clinicians and non-clinical staff who collaborate to best serve individuals and families. So I think another important element of funding is thinking about how are we serving the efforts of prevention, and it does not always require by any means licensed mental health professionals, and that there is funding and resources for non-clinical staff who can do a tremendous amount of work for the prevention of child sexual abuse. Okay, so our challenges in funding, as I was creating this slide, I was thinking about the issue of just unearthing sources, which is, of course, why we're here today. And we are a very small agency, and I think a key element of unearthing potential sources that you're going to hear me coming back to is simply who are we talking to, who are we asking about to find out where there are potential sources of funding, and I think a key element, a vital element, is the networking and collaboration that we are doing. I think another challenge in funding is the structure, size, and resources in which any of us work. As I said, ours is very small. I know that from seeing the list of where all of you are from and working, that you represent a range of sizes. I used to think that it was only what I used to call the giant power structures like CDC and SAMHSA and large state agencies would be the ones who got funding, and was amazed, certainly when I was awarded the most recent funding that we've had, that it really doesn't necessarily depend on your size and your structure. It's a matter of being able to clarify what you're doing in prevention, how you're doing it, and talking with key people about it. Another element of challenges in funding is, do we have competent grant and proposal writings? We don't even have a grant writer in our agency. So a key thing that we have always done is been involved with organizations who do have those grant writers and proposal writers, particularly who are experienced in doing so and who will allow us to collaborate with them around that. I think that that is vital, that people with experience doing that. Meeting the funding requirements are certainly a key issue, and what we have found as a very small agency is that we can often meet funding requirements. Again, you're going to hear this over and over again, through the collaborative efforts and just asking people for assistance and support and being clear about what we bring to the table and what contributions we can make. And you see here that I finally get to the word collaboration on the PowerPoint, even though I've been talking about it. And I have here that it is not for the faint of heart, because I think often we are challenged to collaborate with people who may think differently about what we're focused on. And so I encourage everyone to think that collaboration is not something that's easy and that comes easily to all of us. But I think when we are inspired and committed to our belief in the promise of prevention, that it is certainly worth the effort. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the issues of research, whether funding needs involvement in research or not, and then the issue of going the distance. I think unearthing and getting the funding is just one thing. How are we going the distance throughout the timing of the funding that we have? So when I was thinking about potential funding opportunities, I was thinking about the places where our agency specifically has received funding. And so while I've got broader ones here, I'm just going to highlight a few of these. You all can see it and have access to this. But our tiny agency has received funding through the Violence Against Women Act. We have not received direct funding from CDC, but and small elements indirectly through Office of Juvenile Justice, SAMHSA. The Office of Adolescent Health is the current funder for our multi-year project that we're involved in. National campaign kind of comes in and out of our organization. Planned Parenthood, which was a source we never thought would be an element of funding that we've been involved with, and then private foundations such as Annie E. Casey and, of course, Ms., who we're here for. I think there are key elements within our states and our departments of health, mental health, and child welfare, different pockets of funding that is available. I can't think of a time that I've been funded directly through universities, but have worked very closely with different universities in a collaborative process. And then I have worked a great deal with community collaboration for youth violence and child abuse prevention. So what I want to also add is that evaluation, rightfully so, is now critical for funding. What works is vital. Joan and I think Cordelia both mentioned this terminology. My trauma-informed approach for adolescent sexual health has just been bumped into a promising practice, which is a status listing of where the research is on different programs and projects. And a key element that while we focus on adolescent sexual health, that you see there that half of how we're thinking about it is harm-free. And harm-free constitutes harm to self or others and involves all elements of sexual abuse. Then in terms of determining the effectiveness, that's the process. So when a program or a model is considered promising, then we've got to determine what levels of effectiveness through initial studies, and then you see the next one is replication studies, which is the multiple tiers of studies in order to achieve the gold standard, which is the evidence-based. And we are in the process of that as we go forward. So a trauma-informed approach for adolescent sexual health. Joan, in her invitation, asked me to talk about how my story has unfolded, and I think a message that I want to send to all of you is, how are you thinking about your inspiration for prevention? I know that we each do it uniquely and differently, and then we find ourselves in different settings throughout our careers. And one of mine was that I remember making a conscious decision that I wanted to focus my professional interest in communication, certainly therapy services, but in communicating directly to the young people themselves. We work with children really age 0 to young adulthood, and so I started by writing workbooks for young people. And in my agency, trying to think of how we can streamline services and reach the largest number of children. So I've now written 2 workbooks. The second of which the focus is on this, the picture is on the screen. The top workbook for sexual health was totally funded. And so I'm happy to take questions about that, but I don't want to get into detail right now. And a key element that I have seen is moving away from silos and connecting child sexual abuse and teen pregnancy prevention. I think another area we connect is juvenile justice and child welfare. And then you see the second photo on there is the trauma-informed approach for adolescent sexual health. This was funded indirectly through SAMHSA funds, through the Pennsylvania Department of Health and Temple University, to create a document that is downloadable for free for anyone who wants to learn more about that. So that is part of Out of the Blue Good Things Happening, and then to be the change that through this, these key documents have been distributed around the United States. People were working with them, and that's how it ultimately came to a very large federal grant. In moving forward to vital partnerships, it's not just individuals and organizations, but who is in what organization, how are we getting together to communicate. Community stakeholders and how they think about what their needs are and where they're willing to put often very hard-earned funding dollars and in collaborative and effective services. I think it's vital that we have both for-profit and nonprofit partnerships. Researchers, when indicated, when funding requires, but sometimes when funding doesn't require, go ahead and have it. And I think of those researchers in universities, government agencies, and private research firms, and then research study participants wherever our site development is. And I think that that's my last one, and I'll turn it back over.
Great, thank you, Joanne. That's wonderful. And I think what's so exciting about the work you're doing is that you sort of working up in Maine, and then sort of got a call out of the blue essentially to collaborate on a project that is now funded and will be evaluated, which is so exciting. So I'm wondering, just for the audience also, to sort of talk about what opportunities have you seen to fund and to prevent child sexual abuse. And I'm wondering, maybe if while we're waiting for other people to respond, if you have some thoughts about that, Joanne.
I just, Joan, by that question, my concern is limiting it. What I have been amazed by is that when we simply ask people, what do you know about funding in this field, that the opportunities just reveal themselves in the most different ways. As I said, I never would have thought that Planned Parenthood would have played such a key role in my agency's development and the work that we're doing. But think about the number of young people that Planned Parenthood serves through after-school programming, through sex education, and they are now looking at a trauma-informed approach and primary prevention through their sex education that I think is vital around this country, and they're actually global.
great. Well, and I think someone else. Thank you, Joanne. And I think that it really points to different places that you may not think to look. And Brandy Turner mentioned that Lauren Book has some great information on her website, which is listed there. And also just that that one of the things that that I was surprised by, and I think pleasantly surprised, is that the NFL has recently funded 3 national organizations to look at certainly more sexual violence more broadly, but that there will be some funding that comes from that. So I think for people on the call here should be looking to CalCASA and the Alliance and the National Sexual Violence Resource Center for that announcement. It should be coming out in the next month or two.
In early January, I think they're now saying.
Early January. That's great. Thank you, Cordelia. And I just think that church workshops are just a lot of different places where people where you can go, and it may be sort of unexpected places. And I think given the new movie that's coming out around Spotlight, I think some of the church workshops hopefully will be in higher demand right now. So thank you, Joanne. I think I want to take now have a chance to turn this over to Beverly. So Beverly Forston, thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure. Thank you, Joan, Cordelia, and David for the invitation, and to those of you who are attending today. It's certainly my pleasure to present on CDC's role in preventing child sexual abuse. So one of the first things that comes to mind is, why is child abuse and neglect a public issue? Why does CDC focus on this particular topic? And really the mission of the Division of Violence Prevention at CDC is to prevent injuries and any sort of death that's caused by violence. And so our major role is preventing or stopping violence before it happens, so the primary prevention of violence. And so this definitely involves the prevention of perpetration. So our work follows public health, involves monitoring the problem, conducting research on risk and protective factors, creating and evaluating effectiveness of violence prevention programs, helping state and local partners implement prevention programs, and then also conducting research on adoption and dissemination of prevention strategies. So all this to say, this is the mission of the Division of Violence Prevention. But what exactly, or why exactly, does CDC focus on child abuse and neglect? And this is something that's not news to any of us on the call today, I'm sure. But first of all, whenever CDC focuses on any issue, there are a couple of things that are taken into consideration. First of all is the magnitude of the problem. So this is something that I think all of us on the call are probably familiar with. How big is it? How many people does it affect? If we look at self-report data, 1 in 7 children experienced child abuse and neglect in the last year. That's some of the most recent data from David Finkelhor's work. Also, we see that with the National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System, we see 9% of victims suffered sexual abuse in 2013. So we see that it is a huge problem. It also creates a significant public health burden, so the burden that it places on the public in terms of mental health and social problems, health risk behaviors, disease and injury conditions, and also the lifelong health consequences. And we're going to see some of those things in a future slide as well. And also, what role could CDC bring to the potential contribution to solutions? What value added does CDC have? Would CDC's involvement contribute to the solution of the problem? And we think so in this particular case. So the question is, how can we better educate and increase interest in sexual abuse prevention? So it is a problem. We understand that it has these lifelong negative consequences, but we know that funding for us and for those of you who are on the call today often depends on how you're able to convince others about the significance of the problem. So we're interested in preventing it. How can we let people know that this is a significant public health problem and what the opportunities for prevention are? So one of the things that we've been doing at CDC as of late is really trying to figure out how we can also really reframe or rethink about how to make the case or to increase knowledge and interest in all of the different types of violence, including child sexual abuse prevention. We know that some of the strategies we've used in the past haven't been effective in drastically decreasing the rates of child sexual abuse or other types of neglect, although we have seen declines if you look at longer trajectories. But we still see that large groups of individuals and ages of individuals are at higher risk. And so are there things that we can do to highlight the urgency? So there are a couple of things that we're doing, one of which is we want to make sure that the data that we're providing is timely and relevant. And we're as guilty of this as other people, but making sure that our data that we're producing here at CDC comes out more quickly, and so that people can more quickly use that data. Also acting on the cross-cutting nature of violence. We know that risk for violence starts in birth, it continues across a lifespan. And where you have one form of violence, there are also going to be other forms of violence. So when violence occurs early in life, you're more likely to experience violence later on in life. So if you're experiencing child sexual abuse, you're likely to experience some of the other types of abuse later in life. Also, take action now. I think one of the things that CDC has been guilty of in the past is waiting until you get the best scientific evidence before you act on something. And we as a public health agency are required to act on the best available knowledge, so not waiting on all of the evidence to really try to do something about the problem. And I'm going to talk in a couple of slides about some of the things that we have ongoing that are really intended to do this. As I mentioned, trying to reduce some of the groups who are most at risk. We know race and ethnicity, family income are some of the factors that affect children's exposure to violence. Also, trying to think about things to change the environment, to have a bigger population impact, addressing the contextual and socioeconomic factors that might put individuals most at risk. And we know most of our efforts currently are focused on counseling, education, clinical interventions, which are certainly needed, but also are there things that we can do to really have an effect across a larger segment of the population. One of the things that was mentioned in the previous presentation is partnership and collaboration, so making sure that we're uniting the people who are interested in a similar topic, and also emphasizing the health consequences of exposure to violence. As I mentioned, we see that violence is related to a lot of different outcomes: maternal and child health, risk behaviors, non-communicable diseases, injury, mental health problems. And so the more we can highlight the fact that violence is costly and destructive and highlight the urgency of the problem and how much money potentially could be saved by focusing on prevention, then we could potentially have a bigger impact. Also, one of the things that we're trying to do is reframe how we're describing the problem. And so we've been using child maltreatment as the way we describe the issue more broadly, but focusing more on child abuse and neglect and using that terminology, and being specific in the case of child sexual abuse, it's child sexual abuse, and making sure that we're connecting specific acts to what exactly is happening. Also, we want to focus on the positive things we want for children and families. We want to promote safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments, and making sure that that's our goal for all children. We also want to emphasize the relevance of child sexual abuse prevention within the context of what's happening in the current climate and the funding climate. And one of the things that was mentioned in the previous presentation was trauma-informed care. And so emphasizing the relevance of child sexual abuse prevention within that context is important. So essentials for childhood, steps to create safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments is the CDC's vision and strategic direction for child abuse and neglect prevention more generally. And as I mentioned, we think these are the things that are important to assure that children reach their full potential. And this particular framework provides goals and strategies that communities can take to prevent child abuse and neglect, and also promote safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments. So what has CDC done previously to foresee child sexual abuse prevention? The CDC provides funding for a lot of functions that align within the public health model: surveillance, etiology, program development, evaluation, as well as implementation and dissemination. But each of the things that are funded by CDC reflect our research priorities and our programmatic needs for the specific topic areas. The Injury Center at CDC gets approximately $170 million for injury prevention and control. And just to give you a sense of where child abuse and neglect fits in with that, we receive about $5 million for child abuse and neglect prevention activities, which is not a lot to do all the work that we would like to do in that area. We do have the possibility to do some child sexual abuse work with money that comes from the domestic violence and sexual violence work. The funding limit for that is about $17 million. And so we know that some of our rape prevention education sites are using money for child sexual abuse prevention. But I think one of the things that happens is that since you have the ability to do some of that work in child abuse and neglect area as well as sexual violence area, some of that gets lost in the shuffle. Some things that we have done for surveillance, we have violence against children surveys which look at physical, emotional, and sexual violence against girls and boys. It's been conducted in 9 countries to date with other surveys currently underway. In the research and evaluation area, in 2000, the division issued the first R01 research grant that explicitly included sexual violence in the funding priorities. And since then, sexual violence was included in each of the grant announcements each year. In 2001, a new investigator grant was awarded to conduct a controlled evaluation of mass media products developed from darkness to light, which is a national nonprofit organization seeking to protect children from sexual abuse. But I would say that a great majority of the activities that CDC has funded have been under program and partnership activities. As I mentioned, the rape prevention and education programs do provide some funds they do use some of their funds for child sexual abuse prevention. We do provide funding to support the National Resource Centers, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and Prevent Connect. And then also Essentials for Childhood is funding 5 state health departments to implement the Essentials goals, which were included on a previous slide. But as far as I know, at least with the Essentials for Childhood, no states are currently focusing explicitly on child sexual abuse. We also have funded in the past the collaborative efforts to prevent child sexual abuse, which were given to community-based organizations to create statewide prevention collaboratives to support development and implementation of child sexual abuse prevention programs. And then we also have our core violence and injury prevention programs, which are funded separately in many cases from the funding amounts that I mentioned previously. And some of those sites have engaged in child abuse and neglect activities, not necessarily child sexual abuse prevention, but it's an opportunity for those of you who are on the call today to connect with some of the states that are funded under the core violence and injury prevention programs to potentially make child sexual abuse more a priority there. So what can you expect from CDC going forward? As I mentioned, we're trying to do things to make child abuse and neglect more urgent and to make people understand the importance of the topic area. So one of the things that we are doing is a technical package which outlines the strategies and approaches that can be taken to prevent child abuse and neglect. Our investments are also always tied to our research priorities. So we do have new research priorities that are coming out in early November. And as part of that, there are going to be some opportunities for research on child sexual abuse and some of the other types of violence that aren't studied as often as physical abuse, for example. As I mentioned, we also have those programmatic and research activities, the core violence and injury prevention programs, and we also have injury control and research centers that are, several of those are funded in various states. You could connect with the individuals who are leading those in your particular state, see if you can be involved in what things you might add to that. And some of those are doing child abuse and neglect related work, but none, as far as I know, also are working on sexual abuse there. The web address that's included at the bottom of this slide includes funded programs. So if you're interested in whether your state is funded to do any of those activities, you can go to that website to find that information out. And then, as I mentioned, for the research activities, there are funding opportunity announcements that include cooperative agreements, research grants, and contracts that provide opportunities for individuals to get funding for research-related activities to prevent any of our various types of violence, including child sexual abuse.
Thank you very much, Beverly. One of the questions we want to ask everybody who's listening in, so feel free to type away, and I'll start with Beverly, though, to give you a little bit more time, is you and I had both mentioned the fact that it's easy for child sexual abuse, instead of to be doubled because of the efforts in sexual violence and child abuse and maltreatment, to sometimes be lost between or within each of those. So you've mentioned some things, but I want to see if you want to highlight one of those or different. And everybody else, please enter your thoughts with, so what do we do to make sure that child sexual abuse prevention programming is made more urgent? We know it's not a siloed issue. We know it's connected, but we also know it tends to get lost. Any ideas there for both participants, but Beverly, just to pick your brain a little bit more with this question.
And before Beverly does it, I just want to encourage everyone in the audience, please write in. What do you think what can we or you can do to make child sexual abuse preventions more urgent so we have it get highlighted? I know Beverly talked about, there's child maltreatment programs, but sometimes child sexual abuse gets lost in the child maltreatment, or there might be sexual abuse programs, but yet the focus on children sometimes gets lost. So I'd love to hear from you. What are some ideas that you have on how we can be able to create the child sexual abuse prevention being more urgent? And so I really want to encourage you to write in the text chat, because we'd love to hear from all of you on your thoughts. So I just want to encourage people to start doing some writing. And Beverly, I'd love to hear what you have to say about this.
Sure. So I think one of the things that we as federal agencies have been trying to do, and to some extent we've done better at this on some topic areas than others, is really try to align the funding and the work of participating federal agencies, identify where we have overlapping priorities so that we can leverage current investments. And one of the things that happened so within the HHS agencies, there's a federal interagency work group on child abuse and neglect, and there was a strategic planning session in February where time was spent talking about that very topic. How can we align funding? How can we work across our various agencies, identify these overlapping priorities so that we can leverage investments and make potentially a better or do a better job at preventing and also treating sexual abuse in the end. So I think that's one thing that we can do. I think also thinking about some naturally occurring circumstances. One of the things that happens if we think about shooting, for example, and the Newtown incident, over time we've forgotten the faces that are associated with that. So making sure that we never forget who's affected by those things. So trying to bring some stories to that and making this an issue that all people can identify with and everyone can play a role in preventing it. And so I think
Beverly, thank you. And we have a number of comments from people, including Joanne, saying use the 6 pillars from the National Coalition to Prevent Child Sexual Abuse, where a number of us are members of the coalition, and the 6 pillars are different policies to support prevention. And we also have a comment about the importance of lobbying, and another comment that echoes back what you said about the importance of using specific language. So when we talk about child abuse or maltreatment in general, to talk also about child sexual abuse specifically when we mean that, and similarly with sexual violence throughout the lifespan, and when we're talking about child sexual abuse, to use that language. And another comment that was very helpful is the need to look at Foundation's missions and then think about how this issue and preventing the harm and preventing the initial perpetration relate to those missions. So we've had a number of ideas coming in for that.
I think also connecting individuals to, and one of the things that we can do is try to figure out some non-traditional partners, so businesses, and making the case to businesses that this is an issue that affects their workforce. And if you're investing in prevention, you're going to have a better workforce later on as well.
And I saw a comment, Cordelia and Joan and Beverly, about the Ad Council has done national media campaigns on different topics, and have they been able to do this around child sexual abuse?
And we can maybe loop back to that. That's certainly a great idea and something to explore. They have done internet safety, some, but they haven't as specifically child sexual abuse. But the whole issue of what we're going to be doing and how to use mass media, and any ways people are using the media, please let us know and type that in. But we want to make sure we get to Louis DeVaca here. Are you ready to start, Lou?
I am. Can you guys hear me, or do I need to start?
Yes, we can hear you. And right now the slide that's up is your title slide.
Oh, wonderful. Well, that was a tell that we're having a little bit of technological problems on my end. So I'm going to hope that the slides that come up are the ones that I'm talking about, but if not, I hope everybody enjoys the slides that they're seeing. I want to talk very briefly about what the Smart Office is and just tell you a little bit about the Smart Office. First of all, my mother really likes the acronym. She thought it was high time that I came to work in a place called the Smart Office. The Smart Office itself was authorized by the Adam Walsh Act in 2006. And that law really was trying to have a holistic approach to the problems of child sexual abuse. You'll recall in the mid-2000s there was a lot of attention being paid to this, especially around a number of high-profile cases in which the family members, often surviving family members of children who'd been abducted, murdered, as well as sexually assaulted, were being very active on this. And a lot of us in law enforcement and in other communities were able to come together under the leadership of Vice President Biden, Chairman Sensenbrenner on the House side, and others, to come up with the Adam Walsh Act, which very much gave us new tools, certainly at the federal level. And one of the things it did is create this office. It created the National Sex Offender Public website, which had been started a year or two before, but then was really kind of formalized. And more importantly, it looked to bring things together under what we call SORNA, the Sex Offender Registration Notification Act, which was to bring together the 57 state and territorial efforts that were already out there as far as all of the states were concerned to have sex offender notification and registration so the communities knew who was around them, who was living near them, who was working near them, et cetera. And also in Indian country, expanding that to almost 180 tribes who chose to be involved. Over the last years, we've realized that what we needed, probably more than anything else, was not to simply be a mute and silent observer of those who offend and then get put on public websites or have a term of supervision or hopefully even treatment, but that we needed to move towards this notion of evidence-based practices to really understand what works and who these folks are. And so we came up with, and again, acronyms are a occupational hazard here in the federal government, and so we came up with something that means absolutely nothing, but if any of you want to name your pets this, it's a great name for a dog, and that is SOMAPI, the Sex Offender Management Assessment and Planning Initiative. And we're really looking at kind of what is the research base around this particular population. Who are the offenders? We can't necessarily look at predictors, we can't necessarily look at prevention until we start understanding who are the people who are actually committing this crime. And in our case, these are people who not only are committing these acts, but then have been caught. So one of the things that the SOMAPI project, which is just a few years old now, did was bring together a number of folks, first in a kind of a convening, and then out of that a research basis. And if you go to our website, which is listed there on the slide about SOMAPI, you'll see the chapters, and we're really excited about some of the things that we've first started honing in on. And the literature review chapters that are out there are basically 13 different chapters. We slice and dice it between juveniles and adults. Now we're looking at juvenile offenders and adult offenders. This is not necessarily set up by the age of the victim, although as we look at typologies, as we look at recidivism, as we look at treatment issues, et cetera, we necessarily end up looking at what particular type of victim, which particular types of offenders are looking at. And this notion of prevention focus and how we look at the offenders, I think, is one of the most important things for us. You'll see, that when people tend to think about sex offenders, they tend to think about pretty skeevy guys, guys that are jumping out from behind bushes or kidnapping children from school playgrounds, that it's all about abductions and tortures and things like that, and flat out pedophilia. But the reality is that there are also an awful lot of sex offenders out there that are garden variety members of the community, people who, if you think about a church gathering, if you think about a family reunion, if you think about a small town distributed across the entire thing, it isn't necessarily the guy that everybody looks at and immediately says, wow, that guy's some type of a child molester. So that, I think, for us, has really driven us as far as thinking about prevention in a different way. It's not necessarily simply knowing who are those people who everybody would look at immediately and say, wow, he looks like a pedophile, but rather, what about the sex offender next door, as it were? Because that necessarily impacts the prevalence of victimization. When we're looking at prevention here in the SMART office, we're looking at prevention both as trying to prevent potential offenders from committing these acts, but also to give parents, children, and others the tools that they need to be able to not become a victim as well. That's kind of two sides of the coin when it comes to prevention efforts in our minds. And as you see with this prevalence, the data out there, although it's always very rough when you're looking at prevalence studies of hidden crimes like sexual assault, but we feel like here at the Justice Department that enough things have honed in on this 20% number, at least in the college experience. In other parts of society, that number is likely far, far greater. The work that's been done in Indian country, for instance, whether it's through Indian Health Services or through a lot of the folks who work with sexual assault, human trafficking, and other items like that in the Native community, tell us that the prevalence numbers are several orders of magnitude higher than that. But this 20% number that you're seeing a lot of around the campus issues, I think it should be waking people up. But you also need to look at the prevalence of perpetration. The studies that are saying that self-reporting, 10 to 15% of male college students say that they have perpetrated. So this is not simply being, these prevalence numbers are not simply coming from victim-based or victimization-based studies. Now, a lot of what we're doing here in the SMART office as far as prevention in the last year or so has been not necessarily at the child level as far as child victims, but has been a little bit more focused on campus. And I think that some of that is because of the responses to a number of the high-profile campus incidents over the last couple of years. We've seen that there is a real need there, and we're positioning a lot of our resources accordingly. But our sister program office, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and partners at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, of course, continue to really lead the charge. OJJDP, very much so on the funding side, NCMEC not only being a strong voice, but then also collaborating with prosecutors, police, and others around the country as far as the child cases are concerned. So as we talk about prevention kind of from the perpetration focus, you'll see on the perpetration prevention matrix slide that we're really looking at a number of different kind of times in which we can intervene, times in which we need to do particular things. In many ways, the SMART office, because of our appropriation, of the Adam Walsh Act necessarily is going to be looking in that lower right of the quadrant as far as the policies directed towards the sex offenders themselves. But we have been lucky in that our General Counsel's office and others have allowed us to look at our funding as broadly as possible under the appropriation so that we really are looking at things that are more applied out there. And so if you look at our funding initiatives, we very much are trying to leverage not only our money, but frankly, we like to spend other people's money. So we like to try to talk OJJDP and National Institutes for Justice and a number of the other Office of Justice Programs entities into doing joint projects that we can put a lot of the brain power behind, that we can have it in the context of the offender understanding that we feel that we bring to the table, while at the same time harnessing their larger appropriations. We have about $21 million each year that this office spends. About $13 million of that goes to the states and tribes for implementation of the Sex Offender Registration and Notification Act. And so those will often be things like new computer systems or digitizing those 20 years worth of old case files that are lining the corridor in some basement of some police entity in the capital city. Even things as basic as getting fingerprint readers or computer software so that folks can actually submit information to the federal government or to the websites. We spend about $1 million a year on the National Sex Offender Public Website, which is what you're probably most familiar with us for, which is what is going to be helping you know who's living in your community, what they were convicted of, etc. So when you factor out overhead, then that leaves us with about $4 million for other programs. And that's really where we're trying to make an impact by being innovative. Again, collaborative funding. We're trying to harness others' work as much as we can. Of particular interest, the youth with sexual behavior problems that we work on with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency. One of the things that we realize is that there is an overlap. It doesn't excuse anything, but there is an overlap between having been a victim sometimes and having been a perpetrator at times. So this notion of looking at youthful offenders to see what their own history has been and what it is that they necessarily need. The circles of support and accountability, looking basically, I guess for lack of a better word, reentry issues in this particular community. One of the things that you've heard a lot of people talk about in the last year or two is the idea of reentry for nonviolent offenders. But the reality is that almost every state and the federal government don't have mandatory life sentences for people who perpetrate sexual assaults. Those people are going to get out. And the reality is they're going to get out having spent anywhere from 1 to 30 years in prison, but they are coming home. Whether it's the home that they left or whether it's somewhere else, they are coming out, and we need to be prepared to incorporate them back into society, back into communities, and not simply because it's the right thing to do, but also because we see the link between recidivism and support. And so the circles of support and accountability as themselves being a preventative aspect. And we're really excited to take that concept now over into the Native American community through our NASOM project, which is the Native American Sex Offender Management Project. We've had 4 get together with tribes just over the last 3 or 4 months, last week at Menominee up in Wisconsin. And we're really seeing a lot of excitement on the part of the tribes. It's not simply the police commanders preparing for when the guy comes home. but the combination of police, therapeutic response, the Native American healers, even things like how do you deal with powwow and other traditional cultural things that the offenders will need to be going to when their victims may very well also be at those things. So we're looking at a lot of trying to get culturally specific reentry programs as a prevention effort. And lastly, one of the things that we're very excited about is some of the work that we're doing on prevention in the campus setting. Last year we had the Campus Sexual Assault Perpetrator Treatment Program at Fairleigh Dickinson University. And this year we have 2 grants out that we're adding to the mix with on campus situational prevention. It's 2 consortia of universities, one led by Portland State and the other one the Center for Effective Public Policy. And that's kind of in the 1.5 million range as far as what we're spending on those 2 grants. And one of the things that we're really interested and really excited about is this notion of situational prevention. What are the situations that increase or decrease the risk of crime to be committed? And those can end up having an impact on potential victims. They can have an impact on potential perpetrators. One of the things that I bring to the table from having been over at the State Department in the trafficking office is, again, trying to stretch $25 or $30 million around the world to fight human trafficking. We had to be pretty innovative. And one of the things that we realized is that our tendency to name, or I guess our fetish of taxonomy in the federal government sometimes ends up siloing the solutions so much that we don't even realize that something that we did is a prevention effort. And to wit, one of the things that we funded as a prevention effort for child sexual abuse and child trafficking was looking at water wells in villages and more efficient cook stoves so that girls and women wouldn't have to go out away from the village to gather wood or to go get water and bring it home, because that was where girls were being abducted by the Janjaweed militia and others in South Sudan and impressed into either child soldiering, concubinage, or being taken up and put into forced prostitution. And so the notion of changing the travel patterns of the potential victim class, the girls and women who were having to leave and go outside of the safety of the village, became a much more effective prevention campaign than any of the posters or workshops or things like that we had traditionally thought of were prevention. And so that's one of the things that we're really looking forward to hearing back from the consortia of universities. And I want to thank Joan for really helping us think about this concept of situational prevention. I think we're very excited about this, and we really look forward to getting the results. One other thing that we're looking forward to, I'll put a quick plug in it, and then I think I'll turn it back over to the broader conversation, is we don't have dates yet other than next year, but we're hoping to put on our symposium on sex offender management. It's something that this office has not done now for about 4 or 5 years. And since we last did it, we have done the SAMAPI project. And so we think that there is now an awful lot that is going to get talked about at that symposium. It has been approved, and that is the biggest hurdle because the Justice Department, in the wake of some conference scandals that you're probably familiar with over the last few years, has toughened up its requirements for justifying having a conference. It has been approved, so it's going to happen. We just don't necessarily have the date, but probably March or April. Might have done it in February, but Joan's going to be in New Zealand with the hobbits, and so we wanted to make sure that she could be there for it. Anyway, I just wanted to thank Calcasa and everyone else. This has been a great webinar for me as a participant, and hopefully what I've been able to lay out as far as what we're doing in my office gives you a different understanding of what we're doing here in the Smart Office. It's critically important that we have the type of information that you and everybody needs about what's going on in their communities, but we are not simply the National Sex Offender website. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much for your comments. And there's various questions coming in, and we're a little bit past the time. We're a little tight on discussion, but we want to start by just going back and asking all the participants this question, but also maybe we can go back, Lou, and you can answer this first. We've heard CDC, we've talked about the public health approach, we've talked about linking these different issues and promoting sexual health. We've, as that relates to teen pregnancy prevention, you yourself talked about the linkages between sex trafficking. We know lots of linkages of early child sexual abuse. Amy Kenzie from Minnesota runs the Human Trafficking Task Force in Minnesota makes the point that that's got a lot of energy and momentum, as that issue does in many states, so that one of the things that she's worked very hard on is getting attention to the link between that and child sexual abuse. So with all of that in mind, the question up is, how does the involvement of criminal justice affect prevention efforts? And we can get, again, this is hoping to hear what you all think. There's a lot of resources that go into the response and costs after, and there's a lot to be learned from the data that you have. So any other thoughts about that while people are getting a chance to type in how does the involvement of criminal justice really affect and inform prevention?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things. First of all, when you look at what the criminal justice system's purpose is, officially from the President's Crime Council for almost 50 years now, officially the criminal justice system is the means for society to enforce the standards of conduct necessary to protect individuals and the community. And so that notion of kind of the normative value of the criminal law, setting those standards, saying here are the things that we as a society not only don't want to happen, but we are going to use the coercive power of the state to punish if it actually does happen. So I think that there's that normative basis, but then that goes out into the communities as well. With the numbers of folks in the criminal justice system that are investigating crimes, that are out there talking to folks, bringing greater awareness to these things. This concept of a criminal justice system being not only about deterrence and punishment, but also rehabilitation, I think also necessarily looks at prevention. I think that for me, though, just to take it out of all of that kind of policy speak, one of the things that we're really interested in is trying to figure out what is the moment of the decision not to commit a sexual assault. Factor out the people who might be serial offenders or some of those typologies. But the folks who are in that picture of the family reunion, the folks I think of as quote unquote normal people, at what point does that decision get made to go ahead in a sexual encounter or not? And anything that we can do to affect that moment, including the fear of getting caught, I think is something that we need to be exploring. So that's a little bit more of my personal thought on it as well. But I think very much so the criminal justice system has not only a role to play, but in many places around the country, it plays the leading role. And I'm very happy that you mentioned the Minnesota thing. My sister was on the board of the Minnesota Women's Foundation, and they were one of the early funders of the effort up there. And talking to her about the funding decisions that they were making as a local foundation and how they were able to increase the awareness of sex trafficking is, I think, it goes to what we were hearing earlier about Planned Parenthood and some of the other kind of non-traditional funders that folks should be looking at.
That's right. I'm in Minnesota and was involved in that effort too, and I think now there's a lot of attention to how we counter demand, which loops back into this prevention and the social norms and the counting not only who this is happening to, but who is involved in individual or financial gain. So thank you for those comments. Joan, I'm checking in with you because we're right at our time with discussion, but we're also right at about the time we want to, you need to get to takeaways. So did you notice any particular comments before we go to that we want to make sure to address?
Well, maybe there's a question that came up, which maybe I think we can address. Maybe just like one question came up, which is, can any of the panelists speak about funding for the evaluation of packaged child sexual abuse prevention programs or child protective programs to move from sort of research-based to an evidence-based program? And wondering, maybe just Beverly, if you see that as part of where the CDC might be moving in the future.
I certainly think that this is something that could be tied to some of the priorities for our research agenda going forward. One of the things that I'll just emphasize again is that all of the things that we fund are related to either research priorities or programmatic activities. But I think one of the nice things about our new research priorities that are going to be coming out sometime soon, it was supposed to be early November, so I'm not exactly sure what that means, but sometime soon, one of the things that we think is important for child sexual abuse prevention specifically is one that says evaluate the effectiveness and economic efficiency of programs or strategies that can reduce multiple forms of child abuse and neglect. And so under that umbrella, we specifically note strategies for the prevention of child sexual abuse are understudied and encourage the study of those things. So certainly see that as something that could potentially be funded by CDC in the near future.
Very exciting. Great thing. And Joanne, I wonder if you want to just take a moment to just speak a little bit about, since you had sort of a packaged program around sexual health, but that how you worked with the Office of Adolescent Health to make them also consider the impact on child sexual abuse.
Thank you, Joan, so much. I was hoping that you would ask, and Angela, thanks for the question because it's vital. So I'm going along having this intervention, I'll call it, and it gets the attention and ends up with the $4 million grant. And I think a key thing is, Angela, is to talk to people. And I'll just, because time feels tight here, identify specific elements of what the package is. Ask anybody you think of who will review it for you. And I'm happy to volunteer that and to review and say, okay, from all the different funding sources we've experienced, here's where I would go forward and look for things. And in looking for the announcements for funding, I think it's key in who you know across different things. So when I saw your question, I immediately thought Health and Human Services, Child Welfare, who's funding that, and how would we go to find connections and to get people to collaborate. So in just a few minutes we have, I don't want to take too much time here, but Angela, I'm happy to speak more with you about just exploring options and avenues.
Great, and all your contact information will be at the end. So Angela, stay tuned. You'll see how to reach Joanne also. So one action, one question we'd like to ask is sort of what's one action that you plan to take based on this web conference? And that's something we'd like to ask of the audience. And if you could type in anything that that maybe that you learned today that you might that help you move forward on this question of finding sort of funding and maybe finding funding in unexpected places. And I'm wondering, just in terms of one action that is going through, for me starting with you, Joanne, what's one action that you would suggest that people might take based on what we've heard and talked about today?
Well, this may sound kind of odd, but one of the things that I was thinking about as I was listening to the entire presentation that I don't think that I focused on is that one of the pillars of prevention is education, but not just community education, but sex education and sexual health information is a key element of primary prevention. And one action that I would encourage all of you to take is to consider that in the United States we have 37 evidence-based sexual health curricula that have been proven to delay onset of sexual behavior that is primary prevention, and to think about sexual health, sexual information, because sexual health and sexual harm are mutually exclusive.
Great. Beverly, do you have a thought?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I heard from several presentations is really doing more of connecting the dots. So connecting the dots across, for us at CDC, across the various types of violence. But I think connecting the dots, and this relates back to what Joanne was saying as well, connecting the dots across child sexual abuse prevention, as well as some of the other things that are associated with it, teen pregnancy prevention, and also partnering with people who have those similar interests and figuring out how to leverage resources. And even if, for example, in our work with the core violence, injury, and prevention programs or the rape prevention and education programs, figuring out who in the states are engaged in that work and trying to let them know how passionate we are about child sexual abuse prevention and how much of a difference they could make in focusing on that particular issue as well. So finding those partnerships and potentially some non-conventional partnerships to really make the case for the importance of prevention.
Great, and certainly that's being echoed by Vivian Fernandez, who said also that she's planning on having a conversation with the Rape Crisis Center about what their efforts are around child sexual abuse prevention. Lou, do you have anything you'd like to add to this before we move on to the next piece?
I think one of the things that I was really struck by the other presentations and was thinking about even during mine is how in some ways we need to strike the right balance between the siloing that needs to be done, because we have to identify, what is the best intervention for kids, what's the best intervention for adults who suffered abuse as children, what's the best intervention for adults who are suffering abuse as adults, but also that we need to not get so in love with those differences that we ignore the commonalities. I think that we have to take the victims and frankly the perpetrators and the prevention opportunities where we find them, rather than each of us necessarily working on our own part of it based on our funding stream or where we're located. So I think it's breaking down those barriers so that we can have that sense of urgency that I think we all agree on.
And thank you. Those were great. We have just a little bit of time, and again, we're asking for the listeners, participants, to please answer this as well. Something you're taking away. We want to have us each think about what we're taking away from today. And in order to start that, we're going to go back and ask you something maybe that you're taking away from what someone else said or what a participant said. So if we could just go back and have Joanne start that off. What's a takeaway from today?
Oh, my goodness. I think for me personally, it's that collaboration keeps broadening, that we are doing such a good job in terms of moving away from the silos, and just the three of us who were presenters, in addition to the three of you who are the facilitators of this, how we continue to exponentially multiply the connections we have to cross-pollinate funding and results.
Great, thank you. Beverly, takeaway.
I think one of the things is related, actually, and I probably keep coming back to this point a lot, but really trying to figure out who, and this is the whole point of this presentation, I think, is who are some of the non-traditional people who would think about in prevention, and criminal justice being one of those. Who are some potential partners we can have in this process that can really add a lot of value to how we approach our prevention work, and making sure that we're addressing it from all the various angles and doing a better job at our prevention efforts.
Great, thank you. And Lou, a takeaway.
I think, my biggest takeaway is actually from one of Joanne's slides, which is the one with the CREA partnership, the Un Mundo Sin Violencia Sexual, because I think that that's really what all of us on the call are working towards, and that is a world without sexual violence.
I think that sets up Joan's quote very well. Thank you.
Right. And I just think this is just a quote I love from Eleanor Roosevelt. It says that when will our consciences grow so tender that we will act to prevent human misery rather than avenge it? And what I love of that is that this, I think that, I think someone, in terms of the silos and really reaching across those silos is sort of one way of beginning to expand what's possible. So I just want to also mention these, so that these slides, again, will all be posted. So we have contact information for each of our speakers, and I already see through the chat that Joanne is already talking with Angela, so that's wonderful. And please, use the slides and opportunities and all the contacts that David will also put in. And back to you, Cordelia.
And we just want to reiterate what we started with, is that in this particular season of this series, there will be 3. So our next webinar will be on building a movement to end child sexual abuse in January. And as David said in the opening, all the sessions from all the years are recorded, so it's a wealth of information that you can access. So again, I think we want to get to the spot of saying thank you to our participants and our panelists. And Joan, I'll turn this one over to you since you were lead on this session.
Great. Well, just really, I'm so excited to have a chance to have Joanne and Beverly and Lou all here. I think you're representing 3 such different perspectives, and just really sharing a wealth of information. I want to thank the audience. It's really wonderful to have you here. I'm still left with, whether I want to be calling my next pet a Somapi, but other than that, I think this has been a fabulous presentation. I've learned so much, and it's really been exciting to have you all here. So thank you, and we hope that you'll come to our next web conference as well. Take care.
Okay, and thanks everyone. This concludes today's Power in Prevention Ending Child Sexual Abuse web conference. We look forward to seeing you join us in January. An announcement will be coming out probably in December with that. So thank you much, and this concludes today's Prevent Connect Power and Prevention web conference. We'll see you soon. We will post the slides and the chat with all the links, and there will be a recording available online. Give us a day or so. Thanks a lot.